I told you last week, Jawarn Howell is the future of South Carolina State football. And this weekend against Howard, he proved why that was the truth. Oh, yeah, it's locked on HBCU. Play my music.
You are Locked On HBCU, your daily podcast covering HBCU sports. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, family? Welcome back to another episode of the Locked On HBCU podcast, your number one daily one-stop shop for everything HBCU athletics, Monday through Friday, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And I, of course, am Darian Gray, a.k.a. the Mouth of the South, Texas Southern alum and former TSU Herald Sports editor and current contributing writer at USA Today's Saints Wire. I appreciate you for making this your first listen of the day every day. And remember, just because the mic cuts off does not mean that the journey is over. It just means it's time to follow me on Twitter at South Exclusives. Starts with an S and ends with an S. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app today and use the code LOCKEDONCollege to get $20 off your first purchase. We wrap up today's episode with the ramifications of Tennessee's loss to Charleston Southern and what it means for their conference championship hopes. Prior to that, we also look at what happens when you keep playing close and playing close and playing close. You finally get got, and that's what happened to Howard. And one of the big reasons you could say that is the lead segment, Jawarn Howell. Last week, I told you, and this isn't even so much a pat on the back for me. It's just kind of it is a pat on the back. I can't even look. I feel good because I told you last week, Jawarn Howell is the future of South Carolina State football. And this weekend against Howard, he dropped 283 yards along the way to proving why that is the truth. I wanted to come up with some nice little way to say I wasn't patting myself on the back. But when you start off your biggest takeaway with I told you, it ain't time to fake modesty now. That ain't the time for all of that, right? Because at the end of the day, the reason Howell being the future of the Bulldogs football for, let's just say the next 3 years, 2-3 years, the reason that was so important is because, one, we're speaking about the future success of a program, right? That's number one. And the future success is only second to the current success. But wins and losses are always going to be the most important thing. So when you're looking forward versus now. And then the other reason it was so important is because there was a lot of uncertainty. And that's because Buddy Pugh is retiring at the end of the season. So with Jawarn Howell being a freshman, he's a freshman running back, a true freshman running back. For him to be in that position with the head coach leaving, you would I don't know anybody in South Carolina that is a Bulldog fan. No matter where you are, South Carolina, North Carolina, Texas, Alabama, Georgia, don't matter. You cannot be a South Carolina State fan and not be yearning and hoping hard that Jawarn Howell stays here. And I'll say this, if Howell leaves, it has to be because Buddy Pugh left, not because of whoever the other coach they brought in is. And that's a big difference, but that has to be the case if he leaves, right? If he goes anywhere. But he's the engine. As a matter of fact, I almost feel like calling him the future is wrong. He's the present. When I look at what Corey Fields did, or probably for a better term, did not do through the air on Saturday, Jawarn Howell isn't the future. He's the now. Jawarn Howell is the truth. He's the guy. 283 yards, almost a South Carolina State record, not for freshmen, just record, period. And he did this against a really good team in Howard. Let's read what Corey Fields did through the air, right? You had 3 for 11, 19 yards, and 2 interceptions. Now, to paint the full picture, he had 96 yards on the ground. That doesn't do anything to sway me, but I believe in giving you every single thing along with my take so that you can have all of the information. I remember being younger, and even to this day, sometimes somebody will only give you their side of the take. And if you're hearing it from that side, oh, well, of course it sounds like gospel, but I'm going to give you everything. Fields had 19 yards passing. He had 96 yards on the ground. For me, those yards on the ground are meaningful, but they don't mean nearly as much as the fact that you were poor through the air. You had 2 interceptions and 3 completions. You had 19 yards total on the day, but you had Jawarn Howell behind you running for 283 yards. No, he's not going to do that every single week. No one's projected him to do that every single week. But I'll tell you this, I'm sure glad that I said he was the future last week, because that wouldn't even be a topic. Of course he's the future now. It's clear as day. But at that time, it was like, I don't know. They just came off a blowout loss versus North Carolina Central. The circumstances was a little bit different. I'm glad I said that then. I didn't sound like Brainiac or anything, but I was a little bit ahead of what I was a little bit ahead of it. Now it's obvious, right? But it also showed me the one part about it that I felt confident in. Jawarn Howell allows you to have average quarterback play. On Saturday, they had significantly below average quarterback play, and they were still able to win. I don't think you can make it to a championship playing like that. You can't have a quarterback completing 3 passes for 19 yards. It's not possible. You're not going to win games that way for a long amount of time. But Jawarn Howell allows you to be able to get through some games in that way. And going forward in the future, you just need to make sure you have at least average quarterback play. You don't have to have great. You need to have at least average QB play, because Jawarn Howell is the engine of this team now. Jawarn Howell will be the engine of this team going forward. And if he's not, there's a significant problem with the coaching. He is clearly the player who you need to build around. You clearly need to make sure that you have offensive linemen so that you can run. You need to make sure that you have some sort of passing threat from your quarterback position. That's important. But all in all, one thing can't be denied. Jawarn Howell is the undisputed future of South Carolina State football. And I might have to stop calling him that, because he seems like he's the present, and he's the reason that the Bulldog season is not over. I labeled him the future because I thought it was going to be over. But because of what he was able to do on Saturday, the South Carolina State Bulldogs still have a chance to be able to win. The MEAC is going to take a little bit of effort, of course. Not effort, but it's going to take a little bit of finagling. It's going to take a little bit of help from outside forces. But in no way are they finished, at least not yet. But I'll tell you one team that is in a significantly worse position. They can save themselves, but they're not in the greatest position, and that's Howard, because the bad habit of keeping games super close has finally came to bit them in the butt. And I'll show you why that was so concerning as we continue with Locked On HBCU. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel, and FanDuel is the official sports book of the Locked On Podcast Network. And FanDuel is super easy, right? So you put down $5 first off, and if you win your first $5 bet or more, you're going to get $150 back in bonus bets. So they're going to reward you so much more, like double, triple time, for simply being good at what you do. Doesn't matter if it's the NFL. We just had a Monday night game last night. Thursday night's coming up in a couple of days. I know people don't love it, but it's going to happen, and you can make some money off of it. So why not go ahead and get that done? You're going to have college football. You're going to have the NBA. Hockey is back in season. You have everything that you can do on FanDuel.com/lockedon. And it's simple. $5. A $5 bet, if you win, can turn into $150 back in bonus bets. Seems like an easy decision to me. So what are you waiting for? You can open up another tab. You can go to your phone if you're on the phone right now, or you can go to your web browser if you're on the phone right now and type in FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every moment more. As we continue rolling on today's episode of Locked On HBCU, I appreciate you for making this your first listen of the day every day. And remember, on Friday, we'll have our college football kickoff live, which is going to make you a smarter fan, a more educated, more informed, and more aware fan of everything that's going on around the country. Not only our HBCUs, because I got you here every single Monday through Friday. But right now, we're looking at Howard, because Howard has had this problem. Howard has been playing teams way too close. Howard has been not living up to their expectations. Now, I felt as if it was North Carolina Central and Howard in that upper echelon. I felt as if we were building up to this Saturday, November 11th. I felt like this was the moment we were building up to being the MEAC championship game. And had Howard won, this more than likely was going to be the case. But because it's not, it's a whole lot more going on. But overall, they've disappointed me since they started MEAC play. There had been nothing prior to 3 weeks ago for me to say that North Carolina Central and Howard were not the upper echelon. Delaware State was doing whatever the heck Delaware State is doing. South Carolina State was out here having Buddy Pugh saying, I know more and more isn't good. Norfolk State was being up and down. Then you look at Morgan State, who after the first game, they weren't able to get another victory until just last week. Like, this is not a situation that I thought was in any question. Meanwhile, North Carolina Central is doing what North Carolina Central does. And Howard was out here competing against Eastern Michigan, competing against Northwestern. They were competing against FBS opponents. But this is why you cannot become too invested in quote unquote good losses. We throw these terms out there, and I do believe in them. Don't get me wrong. I believe in them under certain circumstances. When you're looking at a peer, there's no such thing as a good loss. That doesn't exist with it when it's a peer. But if you're punching up, there is a such thing as a good loss. And you thought that when they started punching eye level, it would translate into something better. And of course, you can always spin whatever. When Howard is playing close against Delaware State, well, they know how to pull games out. When they're coming back from behind in a certain way against Norfolk State, oh, well, they know how to be resourceful in the fourth. But I blame them on Norfolk. You know, after we see the repeated trend that they have. But overall, they have not produced the way that they were supposed to. They played close in week 1. They played close in week 2. And now in week 3 against South Carolina State, it finally bit them in the butt. And now they've lost. And now they don't have as much leverage as they would have had coming into this game against North Carolina Central. But let's keep there. Let's keep talking about that, because I don't think that this is something that should be overshadowed. Them in North Carolina Central were compared well before they are going to play each other. They've been compared throughout their out-of-conference season. They're going to be compared, or they have been compared in the MEAC season. Now they finally get to show down. Luckily for Howard, it's only one loss. It's not the end of the world. A lot of times I speak passionately. It might seem like it's the end of the world, but it's not the end of the world. But you can't keep playing teams close. You keep playing like you played these first 3 weeks, you're going to get smoked. You keep playing the way you played these first 3 weeks, North Carolina Central is going to come in there and they are going to smoke you. I'm not kidding. Let's look at the comparison of MEAC outcomes throughout the season. And we'll start off with Howard. Howard beat Norfolk State 27-23. They beat Delaware State 17-10. And then they lost to South Carolina State 24-27. In every one of those games, you entered the fourth quarter either tied or behind. In every single one of those games. Meanwhile, you look at North Carolina Central, they beat Morgan State 16-10. They beat South Carolina State 62-28. They beat Norfolk State 38-24. So you're looking at two common opponents. One was a drastic difference. One you lost to. And I think this is kind of funny. This is kind of funny. And we'll see how it happens. But this is the team in South Carolina State that Howard kind of poked fun at North Carolina Central for losing to. Of course, it was a year ago. I get it. But now, after these outcomes, the question now becomes, did I overrate you? Are you not living up to your standard consistently? Or am I underrating these other opponents? Maybe I'm underrating teams like Norfolk State. Maybe I'm underrating teams like Delaware State, like Morgan State, like South Carolina State. But I've seen what North Carolina Central did to other people, and it seems like they're a class above the people that you're not a class above by the way that you're playing. Meaning that North Carolina Central appears to be a class above Howard. Of course, all of this goes by the wayside starting next week in our game of the week. Howard versus North Carolina Central. But I'll tell you this. if I had to put my money on who was going to win based on what's been happening this year, it's going to be North Carolina Central because they look like an upper echelon team. When they face other teams in the MEAC, they beat them, and they beat them handedly. They're not playing around. This time you weren't able to come back. You outscored South Carolina State in the fourth quarter, just like you did your other couple of opponents in the MEAC, but this was not enough. The hole was too deep. You weren't able to climb yourself out of it, and you have to stop playing this way. You have to stop playing this way. I'm not saying that you can't be tied or slightly behind North Carolina Central when the fourth quarter starts. But if you're playing like you played those other 3 times that led to it being a slight deficit or a tie, well, North Carolina Central is going to have a nice size lead, and you're not going to come back from that. So that's the issue. Finally bit them in the butt. But let's move off of MEAC business. Let's look at Tennessee State in the Big South-OVC because they had another devastating loss. Howell will be able to easily come back. All they have to do is beat North Carolina Central, and then we can deal with everything else after that. But Tennessee State, on the other hand, the loss that they just picked up is going to be pretty damaging because they missed out on an opportunity to be a half game behind for the first place lead in the Big South-OVC. And let's look at that as we continue with Locked On HBCU. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time, and Game Time takes care of all of the procrastination that we know you you kind of do it every now and then. It's okay, though. It's okay because the one time where it's not going to hurt you is when you come to Game Time, because this is the best place for last-minute ticket deals. This is the best place for any sporting event, any theater event, any comedy show, any concert, anything happening in your city. Matter of fact, wherever you live, you in Atlanta? You in Atlanta right now? Let's go ahead and look through the tickets. Who's going to be performing? What shows are going to happen? What comedy is going to be happening? Let's go ahead and get a laugh in. And you know what? Game Time is so confident that they will not be topped that they're willing to pay 110% back on the difference if you are able to find a seat in the same section, in the same row as the one that you bought on Game Time. They will give you 110% back on the difference. All you have to do is download the Game Time app. Use the code LOCKEDONCollege, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Download the Game Time app. Use the promo code LOCKEDONCollege, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. As we're wrapping up today's episode of Locked On HBCU, I appreciate you for making this your first listen of the day every day, making it all the way to segment 3. And I thank you 2 times for that. Thank you. Thank you. Tennessee State, they had so much momentum. It felt like so many things were going right for the Tennessee State Tigers. And then this past weekend, they halted a lot of their momentum because I seen them in the FCS playoff race. They were not that far behind as far as teams who could win the Big South-OVC in their first year of the merger. And had they won this game, they would have been a half game behind UT Martin. Now, this is a team that they lost to. However, there was 2 other teams who had 1 loss. And Tennessee State would have made 4. So you have Southeastern Missouri, which you hadn't played yet. And then you also had Gardner-Webb, which you had played and you had beat. So you were Gardner-Webb's 1 loss. I'm not quite sure how the tiebreakers would have worked. I should have checked to see who Tennessee or who UT Martin's 1 loss was to. Because if it was to Gardner-Webb, now you're looking at a whole different conversation, right? So their 1 loss was to Georgia? What? Oh, here you go. It was to Gardner-Webb. It was to Gardner-Webb. So now you're in a position where you could have possibly been in a 3-way tie with all teams, all parties involved having lost to each other and having beaten each other, right? And let's see if UT Martin had played Southeast Missouri. They're about to play this week. That's the situation that you were in. Tennessee State was in a situation where they could have been in a 4-way tie, essentially, right? UT Martin had a half game on everybody because they're 4-1 in the conference. Everybody else would have been 3-1. But you're in a situation where you've been in a 3-way tie, or 4-way tie, excuse me, with Southeastern Missouri, UT Martin, Gardner-Webb, and Tennessee State. You don't play Southeast Missouri. Sorry for keep saying Southeastern, but Southeast Missouri, you don't play them. Whatever. Throw them to the side. They're good. They're out of here. But you played and you beat one of the other teams. You played and you lost the other. You were in a great situation. But the collapse at the end of the game, that's the reason that now you're 2-2. And now your FCS playoff hopes are a little bit slimmer. Now your Big South-OVC championship hopes are a little bit slimmer. Now you're just in a much worse off position. But let's look at how it happened. Because we looked at the ramification, but let's look at how it happened. The offensive line was getting tore up. You know, up to this point, late in the game, they had already allowed three sacks on the day. They ended up allowing 7 on the day. And we're talking about in the last 4 or 5 minutes that they allowed 4 more sacks. Davion Bryant was sacked 3 times. All 3 of those times were on his last 2 possessions of the of the game. They threw Draylon Ellis out there when the game was pretty much over. It was 35-21. They just threw him out there for that last possession. He got sacked in there too. The wheels came off the offensive line at the end of the game. In that first sack, the first sack of Davion Bryant's night was the worst one of all because he tried to make a play. I'm assuming. I'm putting myself in his brain. And that's, you're at the 28-yard line. You're tied up. They really on the either side, it was really difficult to score. More so for Charleston Southern because Tennessee State had the clamps on him. You seen Terrell Allen, he just came alive, made his first sack, right? He had his plays. This was a difficult second half for Charleston Southern, who had scored no points. And it was a tied ball game. You're at the 28-yard line, hoping that you can make a field goal. You're about to get sacked to be at the 35. I'm thinking that Bryant said, I got to get this ball out because I can't be costing my team 7 yards. But in thinking that, you ended up costing your team 7 points because that was a very risky play. And I'm assuming he was just trying to get rid of the ball because he didn't want to take the sack because he knew maybe being at the 35-yard line, that's a 50-yard field goal. Maybe you're not able to make that. But in that time, because I don't think if he just accepts the sack that he ends up fumbling. He fumbles while trying to throw. I thought it was crazy that play was not reviewed. I thought it was absolutely insane that they didn't review that play. And I'm not saying it would have been overturned, but they didn't show us the appropriate amount of angles either. He was trying to throw the ball. It was just a matter of if he was able to move his arm forward before he fumbled. And nobody thought enough of the play to go back and look. This was a touchdown. Or no, it wasn't. This is a near touchdown. It didn't get returned for a TD, but it got returned to like inside the 20. And that was a tough one. Then you end up going into the next drive and you get sacked 2 more times on the next drive. In every single play, there was pressure. Even when he got the ball off, there was pressure. I'm not saying he's holding the ball forever. I think he might have held the ball a little long on that first sack. But the other times, you're looking at an offensive line that was allowing quick pressure. And that's why nothing was able to go. Every single one of those 4 plays, they allowed pressure, and it ended up being a turnover on downs. And that was pretty much the dagger. If that wasn't the dagger, then Charleston Southern scoring on a 25-yard run the next play was the dagger. Like, this was extremely difficult to watch at the end. And then when they explained the ramifications of it, it was kind of a tough pill to swallow as a Locked On HBCU host. And I'm rooting for Tennessee State. They're not going against any other HBCUs in conference play, so I can root for them unapologetically. You know, that's how I look at it. I'm not rooting for nobody other than Texas Southern in the SWAC. I ain't rooting for nobody in the MEAC. I do have teams that I'm a little bit partial to. I do find a little bit more fun to watch on both sides, whether we're talking about the MEAC or the SWAC, but I'm not rooting or feeling any kind of way about any team that's not Texas Southern. Meanwhile, Tennessee State, I can root for them because they're going against non-HBCUs. I'm rooting against every team, every HBCU when they're out of conference. And I'm rooting for Tennessee State when they're in conference because they're not playing against any HBCUs. But this was just a tough one. This was a tough one. This was a tough pill to swallow. And it was one where Draylon Ellis got sacked 4 times on the night. Davion Bryant got sacked 3 times on the night. That's 7 sacks in a very important game, and one that could have helped you possibly make the FCS playoffs or make it to the conference championship. Oh, well, we're going to look at when they do great. We're also going to look at when they struggle. And last week, they struggled. Hopefully, you're not struggling to continue making this your first listen of the day every day. I'm hoping you're telling people to do the same thing that you're doing. But on tomorrow's episode, we'll be back. We'll look at our polls. FAMU made into the top 10 nationally in the FCS coaches poll. So that's definitely a big thing and one I want to look at a little bit deeper. But in the meantime, in between time, until the next time that we hear each other, family, take care. Stay blessed. Peace.